In your book, World 3.0, you say that the world is not as globalized as we tend to think that it is. Why is that, and why is this important to know?
This conclusion of, what I neutrally refer to as globaloney, this tendency to overstate how globalized the world is, this was a bit of a surprise to me when I encountered it. What actually happened was, I'm a big believer in using simple data rather than pure assertion to try and advance the discussion. So I started collecting some data on how globalized various activities that could either take place within or across national borders actually were. So things like, for instance, telephone calls. So what percentage of all the telephone calling minutes in the world last year would you say were accounted for by international phone calls? Say, plain old telephone service and Skype. Turns out the answer is, if you just look at plain old telephone service, it's about 2%. If you look at Skype, it brings the total up impressively to about 4.5%.
Really? That's it?
And yet, when I present these data to students, executives, huge disbelief. What are your sources, et cetera. So that got me thinking, if they don't believe the data, what do they believe? Then I started, and this is what I generally do to start my courses out with. I have students guess values which they probably have no prior exposure to, just as a way of sort of pointing out to them that their intuitions are somewhat mismatched with reality. So on the phone call question, I often get answers 30, 40, sometimes as high as 60%. I'm an economist, I'm used to error terms, but when I see an error of 1,000%, that's the sort of thing that would give even an economist pause in terms of what's going on. And so why it matters is, well, first of all, it's a good way of unfreezing people's intuitions that they know everything about globalization. If you can sort of start them, Kurt Lewin's old, unfreeze, change, and then refreeze aphorism about how you change how people think. So it's a great way of getting past this shell that people wear around themselves because everybody thinks that they encounter so much globalization in their lives that they just sort of understand it intuitively.
Right.
No need to look at the data, no need to sort of, really read any of the analyses. The reason why it matters per se is from the MOOC that I offered on Coursera, we actually have a large database and have been running some analyses. So it turns out that people are much more prone to believe various statements about globalization being bad if they have overestimates of how globalized the world is. And similarly, they're much more inclined to agree with dubious propositions about global strategy if they have inflated assumptions about how globalized the world is. So an example of each of those, on the public policy side, think of immigration. Basically, in all advanced countries, if you ask people what percentage of the population is first generation, born elsewhere, moved to the US, first generation immigrants, you typically get answers that are 2 to 4 times the actual levels.
Really?
And it's hard to see how this is helpful as opposed to hurtful to having a reasoned debate about immigration. So in Europe, for the 6 major European countries, the German Marshall Fund did a study recently. Average immigrant percentages in these countries, 8%, average guesses, 24%. This obviously contributes to a sense of there is this tsunami that's threatening to wreck everything we hold near and dear. We got to stop it before it stops us. So you get people much more concerned about a set of public policy issues than if they had somewhat more calibrated and generally lower assessments of how much stuff is sloshing across borders in the first place. On the business side, what our data suggests is that if you have inflated intuitions about how globalized the world is, you're also much more likely to agree with such, at least within the field of international business, what are treated as highly dubious propositions like globalization means competing exactly the same way everywhere around the world. This hurts profits because countries still are quite separated as these low levels of cross-border flows indicate, it also creates social ill will, because this is how you get these strategies of bigger and blander, which lead people to worry, are the multinationals displacing our culture?
Right.
Is the world going to look like, is all food eventually going to be fast food served by 3 probably US fast food chains, et cetera? And so both from a profit-making perspective and from a diplomacy, public relations perspective, it would be good for businesses not to think that the best form of competing globally is to do exactly the same thing everywhere. And what our data suggests is that people who have overestimates of how globalized the world is are also the people who are most likely to agree with notions like complete standardization, ubiquity, statelessness, all kinds of things that actually turn out to be quite counterproductive when you're really developing a global strategy.